quorum being present, the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will come to order. The Select Committee is meeting this evening to consider a report on a resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Stephen K. Bannon in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with a subpoena duly issued by the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any time. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. Let me start by saying that it gives me no joy that I've been forced to call this meeting. I think my colleagues feel the same way. The expectation of this committee is that all witnesses will cooperate with our investigation. Witnesses who have been subpoenaed have a legal obligation to do so. And when you think about what we're investigating, a violent attack on the seat of our democracy perpetrated by fellow citizens on our Constitution, an attempt to stop the certification of an election. It's shocking to me, shocking that anyone would not do anything in their power to assist our investigation. So it's a shame that Mr. Bannon has put us in this position, but we won't take no for an answer. We believe Mr. Bannon has information relevant to our probe, and we'll use the tools at our disposal to get that information. I expect that the House will quickly adopt this referral to the Justice Department and that the U.S. Attorney will do his duty and prosecute Mr. Bannon for criminal contempt of Congress. Our goal is simple. We want Mr. Bannon to answer our questions. We want him to turn over whatever records he possesses that are relevant to the Select Committee's investigation. The issue in front of us today is our ability to do our job. It's about fulfilling our responsibilities according to House Resolution 503 to provide the American people answers about what happened on January 6th and help ensure nothing like that day ever happens again. We fulfill our responsibilities by discovering the facts behind the January 6th attack so that Congress can consider legislation with a full understanding of the activities that led to an attack on Congress itself. I want to make it clear just how isolated Mr. Bannon is in his refusal to cooperate with the Select Committee. We've reached out to dozens of witnesses. We are taking in thousands of pages of records. We are conducting interviews on a steady basis. This is the shoe leather work of conducting a serious, focused investigation. It's not flashy, but it gets results. It's essential that we get Mr. Bannon's factual and complete testimony in order to get a full accounting of the violence of January 6th and its causes. Mr. Bannon stands alone in his complete defiance of our subpoena. That's not acceptable. No one in this country, no matter how wealthy or how powerful, is above the law. Left unaddressed, this defiance may encourage others to follow Mr. Bannon down the same path. For folks watching at home this evening, I want you to think about something. What would happen to you if you did what Mr. Bannon is doing? If you were a material witness in a criminal prosecution or some other lawsuit, what would happen if you refused to show up? Do you think you'd be able to just go about your business? We all know the answer to that. There isn't a different set of rules for Mr. Bannon. He knows this. He knows that there are consequences for outright defiance, and he's chosen the path toward criminal contempt by taking this position. And there are better matters at stake. One of the major questions the Select Committee is dealing with is whether the rule of law will be able to endure as a pillar of American democracy. After all, we've seen the rule of law put to the test repeatedly in our recent past. While we don't know all the facts, we do know that there was a powerful push to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 election. Americans have been and continue to be lied to about that. We know that ultimately there was a violent attack that interfered with the peaceful transfer of power from one president to another. We know that lies about the outcome of that election haven't gone away. And now we have a key witness who's flat out refusing to comply with the congressional subpoena and cooperate with our investigation. The rule of law remains under attack right now. If there are no accountability for these abuses, if there are different sets of rules for different types of people, then our democracy is in serious trouble. As chair of this committee, I won't allow further harm to the rule of law in the course of our work. Mr. Bannon will comply with our investigation, or he will face the consequences. Maybe he's willing to be a martyr to the disgraceful cause of whitewashing what happened on January 6th, or demonstrating his complete loyalty to the former president. So I want our witnesses to understand something very plainly. If you're thinking or following the path Mr. Bannon has gone down, you are on notice that this is what you'll face. The process we begun tonight is a grave one. It seldom happens, and we'd rather avoid it altogether. But it's not reserved just for Steve Bannon. If other witnesses defy this committee, if they fail to cooperate, we will be back in this room with a new report with the names of whoever else mistakenly believes that they are above the law. We hope no other witnesses put themselves in the situation Mr. Bannon has through his own conduct, but we cannot allow anyone to stand in the way of the Select Committee as we work to get to the facts. The stakes are just too high. We won't be deterred, we won't be distracted, and we won't be delayed. I urge my colleagues to support the favorable adoption of this report. It's now my pleasure to yield to the distinguished Vice Chair, my friend, Ms. Cheney of Wyoming, for any statement she would care to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. On January 6th, a mob breached the security perimeter of our Capitol, assaulted and injured more than 140 police officers, engaged in hand-to-hand violence over an extended period, and invaded and occupied the United States Capitol building, all in an effort to halt the lawful counting of electoral votes and reverse the results of the 2020 election. The day before this all occurred, on January 5th, Mr. Bannon publicly professed knowledge that, quote, all hell is going to break loose tomorrow, end quote. He forecast that the day would be, quote, extraordinarily different than what most Americans expected. He said to his listeners and his viewers, quote, so many people said, if I was in a revolution, I would be in Washington. Well, he said, this is your time in history. Based on the committee's investigation, it appears that Mr. Bannon had substantial advanced knowledge of the plans for January 6th, and likely had an important role in formulating those plans. Mr. Bannon was in the war room at the Willard on January 6th. He also appears to have detailed knowledge regarding the president's efforts to sell millions of Americans the fraud that the election was stolen. In the words of many who participated in the January 6th attack, the violence that day was in direct response to President Trump's repeated claims from election night through January 6th that he had won the election. The American people are entitled to Mr. Bannon's firsthand testimony about all of these relevant facts. But as the chairman noted, Mr. Bannon is refusing to provide it. Preserving our Constitution and the rule of law is a central purpose of this investigation. The plain fact here is that Mr. Bannon has no legal right to ignore the committee's lawful subpoena. So far, Mr. Bannon's excuse is that former President Trump wishes to invoke some form of executive privilege for a subset of the relevant topics. President Trump's direct communications with Mr. Bannon regarding the planning for January 6th. This information should not be subject to any privilege at all. And certainly, there is no basis for absolute or unqualified privilege for presidential communications. More important now, there is no conceivably applicable privilege that could shield Mr. Bannon from testimony on all of the many other topics identified in this committee's subpoena. Because he has categorically refused to appear, we have no choice but to seek consequences for Mr. Bannon's failure to comply. Those consequences are not just important for this investigation. They are important for all congressional investigations. Mr. Bannon's and Mr. Trump's privilege arguments do, however, appear to reveal one thing. They suggest that President Trump was personally involved in the planning and execution of January 6th, and this committee will get to the bottom of that. Let me add one further thought, principally for my Republican colleagues. We all agree that America is the greatest nation on the face of God's earth. Truth, justice, and our Constitution have made America great. Almost every one of my colleagues knows in your hearts that what happened on January 6th was profoundly wrong. You all know that there is no evidence of widespread election fraud sufficient to have changed the results of the election. You all know that the Dominion voting machines were not corrupted by a foreign power. You know these claims are false. Yet former President Trump repeats them almost daily, and he has now urged Republicans not to vote in 2022 and 2024. This is a prescription for national self-destruction. I ask my colleagues, please consider the fundamental questions of right and wrong here. The American people must know what happened. They must know the truth. All of us who are elected officials must do our duty to prevent the dismantling of the rule of law and to ensure that nothing like that dark day in January ever happens again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Pursuant to notice, I now call up the report on a resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Stephen K. Bannon in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with a subpoena duly issued by the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. The report was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the report.
Report on a resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Stephen K. Bannon in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with the subpoena duly issued by the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol.
Without objection, the report will be considered as read and open to amendments at any time. I recognize myself for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute now at the desk. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Thompson of Mississippi.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I'll now recognize myself to explain the amendment. Yesterday evening, counsel to Mr. Bannon requested a one-week adjournment of our response to a letter I wrote on October 15th, which stated that Mr. Bannon's willful defiance of the Select Committee's subpoena would lead to tonight's hearing. Without objection, I included my October 15th letter in the record, as well as yesterday's letter from Robert J. Costello, Mr. Bannon's attorney. Mr. Bannon's attorney said they needed time to, quote, assess the Select Committee's request in light of litigation filed by former President Trump in the District of Columbia District Court yesterday. However, the former president's lawsuit is immaterial to Mr. Bannon's defiance of our lawful subpoena. I made that clear in a letter to Mr. Costello this morning. Without objections, my full letter is in the record. Furthermore, White House yesterday issued a letter to Mr. Bannon's attorney stating, quote, "We are not aware of any basis for your client's refusal to appear for a deposition," end quote. Before the Select Committee, and further said that, quote, "President Biden has already determined that an assertion of executive privilege is not in the public interest and therefore is not justified with respect to certain subjects within the purview of the Select Committee," end quote. Without objection, I include the full White House letter in the record. This amendment, in the nature of a substitute, updates the report to reflect these developments, and it's now even clearer that Mr. Bannon has no lawful grounds not to comply with our subpoena. If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I now recognize the Vice Chair, Ms. Cheney, for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report to the House the committee's report on a resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Stephen K. Bannon in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with a subpoena duly issued by the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol as amended.
The question on the motion is favorably report to the House. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Cheney?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren?
Yes.
Ms. Lofgren? Aye. Mr. Schiff?
Aye.
Mr. Schiff? Aye. Mr. Aguilar? Aye. Mr. Aguilar? Aye. Mrs. Murphy?
Aye.
Mrs. Murphy? Aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin? Aye. Mrs. Luria?
Aye.
Mrs. Luria? Aye. Mr. Kinzinger?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger? Aye.
How is the chair recorded?
Mr. Chairman, you are not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 9 ayes, 0 noes.
The motion is agreed to. The Vice Chair is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Clause 2L of Rule 11, I request that members have 2 calendar days in which to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental or additional views on the measure ordered reported by the committee tonight.
So ordered. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any necessary technical or conforming changes to the report to reflect the actions of the committee. There being no further business, without objection, the Select Committee stands adjourned.